All right, good morning and welcome to our webinar today. Thanks for joining us. We have some people continuing to come in, so we'll get started now that it's 10:01 Pacific time. Today's webinar is on maximizing training impact, and we have Suzi Weir, who's amazing. We'll do an introduction shortly, but we have some really good content and stats for you today. So happy to dive into this. I'm going to do some housekeeping items before we get started, and we'll maximize our time together. So today's webinar, we're going to do it. We have an hour set aside for this, and we're going to make sure that we have time for Q&A. Suzi's got a ton of content here for you. So if we can end early, we will end early, but we do have an hour scheduled for you, and we'll make sure that slides and recording are available after the session. So that way, if you have to leave early, you have it on demand, or if you want to share with your team, you're like, this content is so valuable, and there's some great stats in here, I want to share it with my leadership team. You'll have all that at the tip of your fingers. This is going to be an interactive session. So we have the Q&A module open. So if you would like to ask questions throughout the session, I'll keep an eye on it. I'm going to pretty much stay in the background today as Suzi's presenting, but I'll jump in if there's a timely question. But we will save many of those questions for the Q&A session at the very end. So feel free to use that. Suzi also has some prompts, I think, early on in the session to use the chat feature as well, get the crowd interacting. So we'd love to hear from you when prompted to do so. All right, quick little introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Suzi. So Suzi is our managing director of learning and development services at Xenium. If you've attended any of our live webinars, workshops, taken any of our e-learning courses, you've likely seen or heard her voice. She's a wealth of knowledge and has been delivering amazing programs for Xenium for many years. And we're lucky to have her today. And I'm your moderator, Brandon Laws. I'm our VP of Marketing and Product. If you listen to our podcast, Transform Your Workplace, you've probably heard my voice. I'm largely behind the microphone and not on screen, but definitely go check that out if you haven't listened to the podcast. All right, Suzi, take it away.
Thanks, Brandon. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for carving out the time to spend with us. I'm excited about this topic. This is what I've created my career around, is learning and development. And so I'm excited to share some information and some of my experience with you that will hopefully help you in your role and within your organization. So we're going to focus on 4 things here today. The first is we're going to talk a little bit about blended learning. So what is blended learning exactly? What can it look like in terms of a program? And what are the benefits? Why should you consider blended learning programs? We'll also discuss steps for aligning training objectives with your business or organizational goals to ensure relevance and impact. So of course, if we're going to be investing time or dollars into training, we want to make sure that we are really clear around the problem that we're trying to solve or the objective that we're looking to reach. So spending some time doing that planning analysis is important. The third thing is methods for evaluating the effectiveness of your training programs. So we'll talk about various methods that you can use to measure results, and that includes continuous evaluation of your training programs. And then lastly, we'll talk about how you can calculate ROI. So if you are making a significant investment, whether it's a large training program or something that's ongoing, it may make sense to actually convert that into some financial calculations and metrics to make sure that you are getting that financial return on that time and monetary investment. So before I dive in, I'd love to hear a little bit from you all. And this is where you can open up your chat and type response in the chat window. When you think about your own personal learning style and preferences, what works best for you? So think about how you learn best. What types of methods or learning styles fit to you? Okay. Melissa says, watching others and then doing it myself. Okay, so observing and then doing. See it, do it, and understanding the why. Yeah, what's the relevance? How is it going to help me? Being shown how, and then given a protocol, so some aids or steps to follow. Right, looks like we have some things in common here. On-demand learning and then doing it myself, kinesthetic and visual, right? So tactile and then also being able to see, reading, seeing, and doing. Kinesthetic, that more tactile and experiential learning. Yeah, I think a lot of us are similar here in that there's a combination of learning styles and approaches that are helpful for us. Great. So let's talk about how we as adults learn. And some of you may be familiar with Malcolm Knowles if you're in the learning and development field. Malcolm is a pioneer in adult learning education. He popularized this concept of 5 teaching strategies for adults. So the first is adults learn best when they understand why something is important to know or do. So many of us take classes because we are looking to meet some personal or career goal. So we're there to learn something, become maybe certified in a particular field that's going to help us reach our goals. When you think about learning styles, right, we like the freedom to learn in a way that works for us. So many of you may remember having a dominant learning style growing up, and this is often determined by our teachers' preferred teaching methods. So think the visual, auditory, tactile styles. However, as an adult learner, you might find, and I think we've seen in the chat, that we prefer a combination of learning styles. The next is adults learn best when learning is experiential. So learning activities help us be engaged, especially activities that help us step away from our desk and when we're in the weeds, so to speak, of our work. So examples can include small group discussions, exercises, role playing, building things, or writing or drawing something specific. Those are great ways to get some hands-on learning and engagement. Adults learn best when it is the right time for them to learn. So we know we have competing demands. Time management is often a challenge for us. And if we're not ready to learn, we won't generally. So this is why it's helpful to assess barriers during the training analysis and needs assessment process, which we'll talk about. So even a strategy for instructors who are facilitating training, when an adult learner says or does something that triggers a topic on your agenda, be flexible and teach it right then, because there is that readiness. Lastly, adults learn best when the education process is positive and encouraging. Well, that makes sense, right? But there is science behind this. So, when people are having fun, when they're having positive emotions and feelings, we tend to retain more information and then we're more motivated to use it. Also making space for debrief activities, opportunities to ask questions are important, and instructors can offer feedback and coaching to support individual learning. So let's talk about blended learning. So what exactly is blended learning? Well, as you might expect, blended learning is a combination of live and online learning to create a more flexible, personalized, and effective educational experience for participants. So it can include any of these methods. You can see here, it could be in-person workshops, virtual workshops, on-demand courses, other digital content such as videos, reading, discussion groups, and generally it's a combination of at least 2 of those things. Blended learning aims to provide a more dynamic and effective educational experience by leveraging the strengths of both traditional and digital teaching methods. So when we think about the adult learning strategies that we discussed a minute ago, first, adults learn best when they have freedom to learn in their own way and also at a time that works best for them. Blended learning offers flexibility. So employees can access learning materials anytime and anywhere, accommodating different learning paces and schedules. So if in my development program, so to speak, or training program, I have options for some self-study and some live workshops, that provides me some flexibility there. Remember, we talked about adults learn best when it's experiential, so we can actually apply it in our jobs. So blended learning allows for engagement. So it's, combining the best aspects of face-to-face and online learning to help participants stay engaged. And if we're using a variety of learning activities, we can cater to diverse interests and abilities and offer opportunities for immediate feedback and then continuous assessment. Adults learn best, remember, when it's positive and encouraging. So the great thing about blended learning is if we're incorporating some social learning and live workshops, we can focus also on team development. So building that team collaboration and trust and those relationships, which are really important to performance. So it encourages collaboration through both in-person and even online group work, and can facilitate teamwork and communication skills. And lastly, blended learning helps with the efficient use of organizational resources. So blended learning options, if you think about it, they're not solely reliant on people delivering the training. We can mix that with a wealth of online resources and materials that can be incorporated into the learning experience. So here are some examples of what blended learning programs can look like. This is not all inclusive, but I've offered some ideas for you. It could be on-demand training that has follow-up discussion groups. So maybe I'm assigned, e-learning courses, and I need to complete them within a certain time frame. And then there is a scheduled debrief or discussion group that's facilitated amongst the people who have completed the courses to talk about what you learned, how you can apply it in your job. Ongoing discussions can include challenges with applying that and additional support needed. Another example of a blended learning program could be live workshops that include practice activities such as role plays, exercises, and games. There could be some prep work that's assigned before that. Another example is live training paired with action learning groups or a cohort. So you may have, whether it's live virtual or live in-person training, and then you may break out into a small cohort group to create some peer coaching opportunities and discuss application of the learning. It can also include live training with homework assignments. So if you're doing a program for leaders, for example, and there's multiple modules that build on each other, there may be homework assignments in between. You might include or incorporate into your learning programs reading and reflection as prep for a workshop. So a lot of times I've utilized books, so that relevant reading to the learning outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And then we incorporate the discussion and takeaways from that reading into the training program. And then another example might be training plus individual coaching. So maybe someone's going through a training program, but then they're also having some one-on-one coaching to help them with their own individual development opportunities and goals. So what I have noticed, and many of you can relate to this, with the shift to more virtual work of the last few years, there was a big shift or increase to on-demand training only. And a lot of that was because we were in isolation due to COVID. But there was that big shift to on-demand only learning. And on-demand learning is great. It's cost-effective, it's accessible. However, it does have its disadvantages. One of the most significant disadvantages of asynchronous video learning is the absence of real-time interaction. It can be challenging for development of behavioral-based skills like communication that require practice and feedback. It requires self-discipline, and maybe someone to monitor completion, and it can be isolating So a lot of us are very social in our learning styles. And so we benefit greatly from being able to interact and discuss with others. And then lastly, it's often not customized to the individual learner. So yes, online learning is a great option, but I would discourage having that as your sole means of training. And I've also noticed a shift over the last year back to more live and even in-person training. And a lot of this is because people are seeing the importance in getting people together and building those relationships and doing that team development in addition to the learning. Last thing I will say about on-demand training, it can be really helpful when you're training on knowledge, right? You need to transfer knowledge. So think of like a compliance type of training. That can be really helpful for quickly getting knowledge out to participants. That said, it is helpful to follow up in some way to ensure participants actually retain that and know how to apply it in their job. So when we talk about implementing training, we want to make sure that we're aligning our learning outcomes with business goals. We want to ensure that our training programs are not just an HR initiative, but they're actually a strategic tool that's going to drive organizational performance and success. So we're going to review some steps that you can take before designing and implementing training to ensure that you're addressing your top needs and objectives. So here are some steps for program development and rollout. The first is assessing gaps in KSA, which if you're an HR person, you know that's knowledge, skills, and abilities. So assessing gaps in knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed to meet your business goals. The next is linking learning outcomes to metrics. So number one, defining those learning outcomes and then how you're going to measure them. And then lastly, ensure stakeholder buy-in and support, which is really important for that sustainable performance and impact. So by systematically assessing knowledge, skill, and ability gaps, linking learning outcomes to relevant metrics, and ensuring strong stakeholder buy-in, organizations can create effective and impactful employee and leadership development programs. And we're going to go into more detail on each of these steps. So the first one is assess knowledge, skills, and abilities to meet objectives. So the first step in that is conducting a needs assessment. So let's put this in the context of an example. So you and your organization have the objective to develop a comprehensive supervisor development program to enhance leadership skills, improve team performance, and support career advancement. So if we are starting with a needs assessment, we're going to identify the current state of knowledge, skills, and abilities among our employees that we're going to have put in this training program. So we might conduct surveys, gather self-assessments from these current supervisors or people who are going to be in this training to understand what are their current leadership skills and abilities. Sometimes I've even asked questions about their level of confidence performing some of the leadership behaviors or responsibilities. You also might consider holding interviews or even having focus groups with employees, peers, and direct reports to gather additional data around the current performance and capabilities of the supervisors that you're looking to train. And even leverage performance appraisal or 360 feedback if you have it. The next step after we have a decent understanding of the current knowledge, skills, and abilities, then we need to figure out, okay, what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities we need as an organization to achieve our goals and objectives? So these are this is the desired state of KSAs. So we want to align our development program with our company's or organization's strategic goals, which could be improving customer satisfaction, increasing employee engagement. And then we want to look at key competencies that are required for supervisors. And these could be things like effective communication, conflict resolution, team building, strategic thinking, for example. So that's the first step. The second part is analyzing job requirements. So this is where it's helpful to have current job descriptions, or if not, maybe an opportunity to review and update those. So reviewing job descriptions, performance standards, and if you have competencies for your current supervisory roles. So you can conduct an analysis of your job descriptions for the supervisors to make sure you've captured critical tasks and responsibilities. And you could also review performance standards. So think about your performance management processes. What are the performance standards and measures to evaluate supervisor performance? And then also any competencies. So competencies generally evolve from the identification of knowledge, skills, and abilities and other characteristics. So at this stage, you might develop a competency framework for leaders. So let's say we're going to design a set of leadership competencies. Those are those desired capabilities that define success for a leader. And we might even delineate between levels of leadership. But for the supervisor level, what are those core competencies that contribute to success in our organization? And so developing that framework for leadership that outlines the essential knowledge, skills, and abilities for effective supervision and leadership. And lastly, perform a gap analysis. So that's where we're comparing our current team's knowledge, skill, and ability levels with the desired levels. So this is helpful because this is where we're going to find the biggest gaps, or hopefully be able to see the biggest gaps, which will help us prioritize the design and learning outcomes of our training program. So we're going to prioritize the areas where development is most needed. So these are areas that are going to have the greatest impact on achieving our organizational goals. Another step that may be included as well is implementing individual development plans. So it may be that you support these individual supervisors and creating individual development plans based on their individual identified gaps and priorities. So if you are doing this, obviously you're going to have some program objectives, but if you want to put together a goal within an individual development plan, then I would encourage you to consider what's reasonable. If there are other goals that they have as part of their job, maybe it's just one goal that's associated with their leadership development at a time, maybe one or two. Okay, so the next step is linking learning outcomes to metrics. So here we want to define clear learning objectives. So think of your SMART goals, for example. So the specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound learning outcomes. So for example, this could look like, by the end of the program, supervisors will be able to effectively, resolve conflicts within their teams as measured by a 20% reduction in team-related grievances over a 6-month period. So that's a way to make it SMART. And relevance to your organizational goals is important. So we want to ensure these learning outcomes directly support your organization's goals, such as improving customer satisfaction or increasing employee retention. So if we're looking at this learning outcome, by the end of the program, supervisors will be able to effectively resolve conflicts within their teams as measured by a 20% reduction in team-related grievances within 6 months. Why is that important? Well, it's going to help us retain employees, right? Or help employees perform at a higher level, or retain those employees that work for those supervisors, and which ultimately may also contribute to how they're serving our customers and impact that customer satisfaction, for example. So we've defined clear objectives. The next is identify metrics. So how are we going to know that we're achieving those objectives? So we want to include metrics such as team performance, increased employee satisfaction, could be reduced turnover rates or higher productivity levels. If you have KPIs key performance indicators that you use in your organization. The training could have some impact or could be evaluated to have impact in those areas. So is the training or the results of the training impacting productivity from an operational standpoint? Is it affecting employee retention rates? Also customer satisfaction scores. You want to have at least some metric, right? It doesn't have to be KPI, but some metric or set of metrics. Don't go too far with too many because we want to keep it focused, but some way of knowing, okay, are you making progress and have you achieved those desired learning objectives? And then last, evaluate results. So here's where you might use pre and post training assessments to evaluate the increase in knowledge and skills. You can collect feedback from participants to refine your learning programs. So feedback mechanisms can include surveys, interviews, even focus groups to gather feedback from participants. And then you can use that to make any necessary adjustments to the program. So the last step in this program development process is ensuring stakeholder buy-in and support. And this is really important because sometimes if we don't have this support, it creates a barrier to learning and results. So the first step is to engage stakeholders and do this early, right? Do this during your planning process. So we're identifying stakeholders first. So typically there's executives, managers, and employees. So who is going to be impacted or who is going to need to sponsor and help reinforce this training? So we want to involve them in the planning process. So we can hold meetings with key stakeholders to gather input and ensure alignment with the organization's goals. For example, it's important to clearly communicate the expected benefits and goals to all stakeholders to help build that support and commitment. And another thing that I've done is I've actually involved the people who are going to be involved in the training program. So in our example of a supervisor training program, involve them in the design, having input on some of the design of the program so that they have buy-in and they feel like, yes, this is relevant to me in my role. The other thing, leaders at the highest level and certainly the supervisors of people who are participating in the training need to demonstrate support for learning. And this includes carving out time and giving employees the space to be able to participate fully in the training. A big barrier that I see is employees are really at capacity and busy in their current jobs, and then they're being assigned or enrolled in training, and they don't feel like they can fully engage or participate because they're feeling overwhelmed with their workload. So that's an important conversation to have early and make sure that you have that leadership support with giving those students or participants the time and space to really fully participate in that training. The next step, number 2, is communicate clearly. So we're going to share the vision and objectives of our training program with all the stakeholders. And that also includes providing updates along the way. So it can be a communication plan that shares the program's vision, objectives, and progress with all the stakeholders. And we can provide regular updates of progress and outcomes through meetings, newsletters, and reports to keep everybody informed about how it's going. The third thing is demonstrating results. That could include ROI, return on our investment. So we can use data, case studies from similar programs to demonstrate the potential ROI and the impact on the organization. And we can highlight the positive impact that it is having on productivity, employee engagement, and overall organizational success. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. And then lastly, how do we create a supportive culture for continuous learning and development? Because just because someone participates in a training program doesn't mean that they're going to be able to achieve and sustain results. So we want to foster a culture that values and supports continuous learning and development through recognition and rewards. So, this is part of your total rewards philosophy or employer value proposition, so to speak, that you offer professional development and career development programs, training programs. So, how can we make sure that employees are able and are actively taking advantage of those? And we may be offering resources beyond training, such as coaching, mentoring, and access to online learning programs to support their ongoing development. Okay, so if you have questions, feel free to pop those in the Q&A. And after we talk about measuring results and calculating ROI, we will have time for some Q&A. But I'm going to keep plugging along here and talk about measuring results. So calculating the return on our training investment involves comparing costs of the training program to the benefits it delivers. So while you may not calculate the financial ROI on every training that you offer, ideally there's at least some evaluation and measurement of results. So this is something that I have a little passion around because I do this type of work, but oftentimes employers will come to me and they're like, I need a training on communication, because maybe they've recognized that there is some conflict with people on their team. And so, the worst thing we can do in that situation is say, okay, yeah, let's put together a communication training, do it, and then assume that that's going to fix the problem. Well, obviously, as we just discussed, there are some important steps that ideally should be taken before putting together and implementing a training program. So first, do we even know that communication is the gap? And then what, is training the best intervention even at this point? And then obviously, what are our objectives and so forth? So the other thing is this assumption that, we implement a training and everything should be, fixed. People should be, have the capabilities and be motivated and everything should be fine. Well, many of you probably have learned from your experience that that doesn't quite work out that way. Think of it like change management. Just because you implement a new process or a new technology and you provide some training doesn't mean that the change sticks, right? So it doesn't mean that training does not equate to ability if you're not evaluating it. And it doesn't necessarily lead to sustained behavior or results. So, the one and done trainings, unless they're just getting knowledge out there, quick knowledge and also having some follow-up or a training aid that someone can refer to afterwards. Generally, these types of trainings don't, result in sustainable results. They do require positive reinforcement, practice, and accountability for people to be motivated and be able to fully develop and sustain new skills and behaviors. So this is especially important when we're talking about behavioral-based skills that are really important in today's workplace. So when you think about communication, coaching, conflict resolution, even those emotional intelligence skills like self-awareness and self-management, stress management, even time management, those are very behavioral-based skills. And so generally it requires ongoing practice, follow-up, feedback for people to really create those new habits and abilities and be motivated to continue them. So that's my plug for that. But many of you, especially if you're in HR, might be familiar with Kirkpatrick's model of evaluating training. So this is a way to measure results. The Kirkpatrick model is a globally recognized method of evaluating the results of training and learning programs. So it assesses both the formal and informal training methods and rates them against 4 criteria levels here, you can see. So the 4 levels start at the bottom. Level 1 is reaction, then it goes up to learning and graduates to behavior, and then finally results. So as you can imagine, getting results is the hardest one, right? That's what we're ultimately going for. That's our goal. with training, but a lot of times we don't get all the way there. So level 1 is gauging reaction. So that's when you're measuring participants' immediate reaction to the training. So it could be verbal feedback in the training, or it could be an immediate survey after the training, immediately after the training ended. So post-training surveys, feedback forms, even interviews, questions like, did you find the training useful? Was the content relevant and engaging? The next level up is learning. So how do we know that participants are really learning the knowledge, skills, and abilities gained from the training? So this is where we might use the pre and post training assessments, quizzes, and assessments as follow-up to see what people have retained, right? The next level up is behavior, right? So this gets a little bit more into application. So how are participants applying what they've learned in their job? So methods to evaluate this could be observation. So, people who are working closely and with the person who received training, are they observing changes in their behavior and application of these new skills and abilities? It could also include 360 feedback, questions that we might ask around this behavior assessment is, are employees using the new skills? Right? Are they actually demonstrating them? Has their behavior changed in their job? And then last, that highest level is results. So this is where we're looking at the overall impact training on organizational goals. So this is where we might look at KPIs or business metrics such as sales, productivity, quality, or even do an ROI analysis. So are we able to link the training and the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are demonstrated to the organizational goals or objectives? So ultimately the questions here are, did the training achieve its objectives, and what's the impact on business outcomes? So again, I will just summarize by saying reinforcement is key to sustain results. So that is a benefit of blended learning and having continuous evaluation and follow-up. So we've talked about some of these methods for measuring training results. We talked about surveys and feedback, self-assessment, those pre and post test options. There's options for people to do self-reflection. For adults, self-reflection is actually really helpful. If we can give ourselves, or we're given space to be able to do that, to reflect on, okay, what did I learn? Or when I applied what I learned, what worked well, what didn't work well, what additional support do I need? So that can be really helpful. We talked about on-the-job observation as a method for measuring or assessing training results. Talked about 360 feedback and other performance review metrics that you have in place. We did not talk about LMS, or learning management system analytics. So if there's on-demand courses that are assigned as part of the training program, there are ways to look at, okay, did the students or participants actually complete the training? There's also ways to look at engagement, right? So did they watch all the videos? Did they answer all the quiz questions? Did they get the quiz questions right? So looking at those things in your LMS. And then lastly, there might be that business impact analysis. So looking at, some of your financial metrics. We talked about ROI, but it could be also customer metrics or operational metrics, such as efficiency. So those are options. Again, I don't think you need to do all of these, but maybe select a couple that they make the most sense for the training that you're offering and your business objectives. So I wanted to share a client example so you can just get a sense for how things work in the real world. This was a client that I worked with and I partnered with to develop a supervisor or leadership development program. They had over 500 employees. They were all working in different states and locations. So there were some logistical challenges in terms of getting everybody together at the same time. They had never done any supervisor development or training in the past. So a lot of these people had just grown up within the company and had no prior training. We started with a needs assessment. So got input from HR in terms of, what were some of the employee relations issues, or what were some of the ways HR was being sought out as a resource, or supporting these people in these supervisor roles, and what were the gaps in knowledge, skills, and abilities that they were observing. We also got feedback from leadership. So the director level, who had these supervisors as direct reports, we asked them for their feedback. Number one, what are the current knowledge, skills, and abilities that you see within your team? And then also, what is important, right? What are those desired knowledge, skills, and abilities to reach your goals? And then we also ask for feedback and input from the actual supervisors who were the participants in this training. And we asked them to rate their level of confidence and ability in a number of different leadership skills and practices. And we told them that we would use their input to, craft and design the training program to meet their needs. So we ended up developing a supervisor development program that was focused on core competencies. So we identify what those competencies were. They were a lot of what you might expect to be the foundational competencies for supervisors, people leaders. We took the information that we gleaned from the assessment and to formulate those competencies, and also how we would design and deliver the training. So what we ended up with, because of the logistics and the needs of the folks there, we put together a set of on-demand courses or modules that were scheduled. So once a month, they would complete a 1-hour on-demand course. So they had 30 days to do that. It had quizzes and actual activities that they would need to complete and provide comments on. And then we scheduled, after every module, a live facilitated discussion session. And so this was like an action learning group where we invited participants to share what were their takeaways, how were they applying what they learned in their job, what's worked well, what didn't work well, what additional support would be helpful for them. Then we did some evaluation to see how this all worked. And so for reaction, we did an immediate, and when we're thinking about those Kirkpatrick levels, we did immediate post-training feedback from participants following each course, just to see how those courses were working for them. Were they engaged in them? Did they find the content helpful and relevant to their role? Then we looked at learning. So we looked at application of the knowledge and skills observed in the facilitated discussion group. So were people demonstrating that, yes, they understood what was covered in the courses? Did they actively engage? Did they make some effort to apply or even consider applying that in their job? We also did a 90-day post-program survey. So we got feedback from the participants' supervisors, and we asked them about their observations of whether their direct report supervisors were applying the specific skills that we covered, and whether they were their engagement level changed. We also asked them about additional training, so gaps that they were still seeing. And then within 1 year, HR solicited feedback from the leadership group, again, those directors, about how their supervisors were doing as part of planning for ongoing training or additional training. So that's one example. Obviously this can be customized to fit the needs of your group. This was a successful one in the respect that, when we asked the directors, whether they've observed improvements in their direct reports leadership behaviors, 78% agreed and 22% said strongly agree. And we listed all the specific leadership behaviors and skills out. So when you looked at all of those combined, 100% of the directors said they either agreed or strongly agreed that their direct reports were actually implementing the skills that they learned. And then the other question we asked the directors were your employees more engaged following the training? So we did this at that 90-day post-training mark. 87% agreed, 13% strongly agreed. So 100% of them said that they noticed an increase in engagement from their supervisor, direct report supervisors following the training. And then in that 1 year evaluation, we asked questions like this. So in which competencies have your direct reports made the greatest improvement or development? And they cited the highest, 87%, was coaching and developing employees. So we can feel really good about those results. We also asked, okay, where are there still gaps? Like, where are the most significant gaps in understanding and practice? And that came up as time management and delegation. So you may think, oh, this is a bummer. We didn't move the needle on all of these competencies, but realistically speaking, there's a lot of leadership competencies. So this is helpful information because now we can say, okay, our next step is to focus on providing more training and tools to help them with their time management and delegation. And then we also asked the question of the directors, what additional support or resources would be helpful for your team's leadership development? And there were verbatim responses here. And the top themes from those verbatim responses were initial and ongoing training for frontline supervisors. We need to continually reinforce what we learned and lead by example. And follow-up is important. So again, they recognized, okay, we know that the training doesn't end after they take the course or participate in a discussion group. This is something that we need to continue and have ongoing practice and follow up with. Okay, so in some cases, you may calculate the financial ROI of your training. So the decision to calculate ROI for your training program will depend on the expected impact, the cost of the program, and also the ease of quantifying benefits, because sometimes it's not easy to actually quantify some of these things. For single training sessions, it often makes more sense to focus on qualitative measures of success, so a lot of that feedback or observation, unless perhaps the session or training program is particularly high stakes or high cost. So here's a formula. This is the standard formula for calculating ROI. So it's the net benefit of the training, and we'll talk about how to get that net benefit, divided by the total costs of your training times 100. So first we need to look at, okay, what are our costs and what are our benefits? So here are examples of some direct costs, and then we also have indirect costs, which, as you can imagine, can be more challenging to quantify, but it is possible. For example, employee time spent in training. We can look at the wages and salaries for those folks during those training hours. We can also look at opportunity costs potentially, like example, could be a loss of productivity while people are in that training. But direct costs are usually a little bit more straightforward, easy to itemize. To the right here are benefits. So how do we calculate these benefits? So productivity, if that's something that you currently measure, that might be easier to quantify in terms of increased sales or production, potentially improved efficiency. Maybe there's cost savings associated with that could be measured as a result of the training, or revenue growth potentially. So you don't need to have all of these, certainly, but I would consider, okay, what might be some relevant benefits that you may want to include in this calculation. So here's an example of what it can look like. So here's a company that invested in a leadership training program for its managers. The cost of the training program is $100,000. So when they looked at all of their costs, it was $100,000, right? So that includes the development and the materials So they likely leveraged a third party. So they paid a consultant fee for that, and the instructor's fees. So that was 50,000. And then they also calculated in that opportunity time or opportunity cost, which is the time that those managers were pulled away from their productive day-to-day work. So their costs were 100,000. Okay, what were their benefits? Well, they were able to demonstrate increased productivity and assign a value to that, as well as reduce turnover. So, maybe based on exit interviews, they know that, turnover was positively impacted because people were engaged and feeling good about their managers, or maybe through engagement surveys, people were reporting better experiences and support from their managers. And then maybe you were even able to link it to a benefit related to customer satisfaction. Okay, these are possibilities. And again, it doesn't have to be all three of these. It's important to come up with a net benefit amount. So this is where you're going to take the total benefits here. And then to get the net benefit, you have to subtract the costs from the total benefits and then use the calculation. So in this particular example, it ended up being 100%, okay, which is pretty darn good. I see a question in the chat and I will make sure to get to it. So again, this is a guide. I don't think you need to do this for every training that you offer, but certainly this is a substantial program, it's investment. So it probably would make sense to calculate, identify your costs and benefits and calculate whether or not you got any return on that investment. So we've covered principles of blended learning and its benefits, steps for aligning training objectives with your business or organizational goals, and then also how to evaluate training effectiveness and demonstrate results. We know that blended learning, which combines different instructional methods, leads to higher engagement and more effective learning as compared to solely on-demand or classroom-based approaches. We also learned that conducting a needs assessment is crucial to ensure that the training achieves the desired outcomes. And it's important to establish methods for evaluating the results or impact of your training programs. And then we just talked about calculating ROI and how it might be particularly relevant for training programs that involve significant investments to ensure that your resources are well spent and that the training is effective. So I will address the question in the chat first, and then we can move to the Q&A. So I see from Maria, would an HR company perform a needs assessment in any subject? As an example, we run a property management company, meaning our staff needs to have knowledge on regulations. How would a regular HR company run a needs assessment? So if you're specifically talking about knowledge, technical knowledge as it relates to your regulations, so for your industry regulations, then I would probably start with first identifying what are the requirements, like what are the regulations, who needs to have knowledge and understanding and be able to comply with these regulations. And then I would do that assessment of, okay, how would I assess the current knowledge of our team, relevant team members as compared to what they need to know, and then prioritize training based on that. So I don't know if I'm answering that question correctly, but who does this is a great question. So you're asking about HR, for example. HR typically oversees training, especially in a small, even medium-sized company. If you have a large corporation, even some medium-sized companies have a learning and development team or group that would help with this. But yeah, I think definitely it could help doing a needs assessment. If you don't know where the gaps are, things like you think about harassment prevention, cybersecurity. There are certain types of compliance training that every team member needs, and they're just a best or required practice. You probably don't need to go deep in that needs assessment. I would be interested in evaluating results and whether or not people learned it and are applying it. But in terms of the front end of doing that full needs assessment, it may not be necessary for those, mandatory trainings that apply for all employees. And let me know if I didn't fully address that. If after 2 years a person still doesn't master their position, can they be put on a PIP? Absolutely. And hopefully there are conversations before then and some interventions to see if we can help provide the training and support that employee needs to become proficient. And certainly 2 years is quite a bit of time. So if someone's not able to become proficient or competent in their position despite ongoing training and coaching, then it probably would make sense to move to a performance improvement plan, or even consider, is this person in the right role, and talk about whether or not there are other opportunities that might more closely fit that person's skills and abilities. Do you use the 360 method for performance evaluation? I was using it, but after COVID, I felt like many people just didn't want to do it any longer. Yeah. So yes, I'm cautious with 360 feedback processes because there is an art to it, not just a science, and it's helpful to have an objective third party help facilitate this, and have experience with how they are administering it, and also probably even more importantly, summarizing the results and providing those to the leaders and helping them utilize those for their development. So I think what you might be saying in your experience here, that people didn't want to do it any longer. I have noticed that since COVID and that shift to a lot of virtual work, we're really inundated with email, and a lot of people are even less inclined or motivated to give feedback to these surveys. So it's hard to collect the feedback. Some people who are receiving the feedback may not be feeling safe or supported or confident how that feedback is going to be used to evaluate them and their effectiveness in their role. So again, that's why it's important to have a really thoughtful process. Okay.
Okay. That actually brings us to the end. That's all the questions that we have time for. I did drop a few links in the chat. We're running our annual What People Want from Work survey. It's a great opportunity to ask your employees what they want out of their work, and learning and development is one of those categories that we address in the survey. So it's great to figure out what your employees want. This is a free survey, so the link there will allow you to sign up. And then also Suzi's running a fall cohort for our People Leadership Foundations. I'm dropping the link in there as well. You're welcome to learn more about that and reach out to Suzi if you want to learn more about that. But Suzi, really appreciate you spending the time walking us through all of this. There's a lot of good information. We will follow up with the slides and the recording. So if you want to share it with your team, and this will be on demand always. So we'll never pull it from our website. This will be available to you and your team. But Suzi, thanks so much for participating in this.
Thank you. The last thing I'll say is I will review the Q&A, and I can follow up on the responses to questions that came in after the fact. We can include that when we send out the link.
Great.
If there are any burning questions, we'll make sure to get to those.
All right. Thanks so much, Suzi, and thanks for coming in for today's webinar.
Thank you.